Yeah, I thought my part had been done, but I was reminded that I had promised to take you word for word through every condition.
You're saying that was the torture assumption.
The statement you've given provided that money is right in the providers. I'm not sure if we've had a chance to read it yet. What it does do is identify the conditions that are still to dispute, as we put it on it. And the actual version that you've got, it makes it easy for you by colour coding those conditions that still in dispute by the two parties in particular. So what I propose to, so let's just very briefly go through them. If you go to paragraph 7 in the
Did you want to say that?
yeah, the statement, sorry, it identifies there a number of conditions which, if you go through this particular document, you'll see is coloured green.
Yep.
And sorry, it should be green, they should be blue. They're ones that the applicants asked for the 20 working days to be included in there. And that's a matter that we did discuss at the hearing. We still haven't got anywhere with that. And then here is the reasons why on top of page 3, I'm of the opinion that that's not reasonable and it's designed to stop any delays. There is a problem that the applicant might have in contract with long retainers and etc. Ms. Ryden's, I heard her opinion in there, or her view in there that she doesn't accept that, so there is a dispute in that one. And I think we're just at the stage here. Really, it's sort of got there for you. With respect to conditions 7 and 72, they are the ones that the applicant is still disputing, and they sort of are connected. So the first one is lot 104. So the applicant's been of the view that it never intended it to be a road asset and was applied for as a reserve. Should, however, there be a resolution on condition 72, which is primarily about lighting, so all the other concerns that were there have been sort of worked through, then the question of whether 104 should be a roading exit or whatever sort of so that's still a matter there that's in dispute in terms of the lighting. And I think the joint witness statement for the shed kind of has different positions there in terms of the applicant versus council. And that being that the 2 lights that have been provided by the applicant is all that's required. And perhaps right wants to hear about the council of the view that there should be more lighting.
We also have evidence of Dave on in the landscape, and I think it's just as good.
And I think there's also
And there was
submission.
and there was also your witness on the septic. So
Correct.
yeah, you don't necessarily want to encourage people to use it.
Yeah.
And also Mr. Higgett as well in his memorandum.
One of it as natural as possible was the best way he described it.
Which one was Mr. Higgett?
There was an attachment, I think, to my evidence, which was him indicating this what his preference was. So he's the RDR.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
the dray track, yes. So he was wanting the dray track with the remains, that part of it, way to be as natural as possible. Didn't support it. So that's an matter there that's still outstanding. As I said, if 72 is resolved.
I think it's 7 tours away.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, in particular view, it should be the road.
I think the general, and I think it's the proper sort of alluded to it, is that if it was a roaming reserve, it's likely to be well maintained. It's carefully worded because obviously it implies that if it's a reserve, it might not be well maintained by the place from a resource and other things. So I think that I think Ms. Fraser's of the view that it probably makes sense to be a road reserve from that perspective.
We just comment on that as well. That there is currently proposed a right of way over the access for 3104, which if it's listed as a road, necessary because we'll leave a road.
Right. So there's a number of factors in there, and I think it's probably at the end of the day it's the most sensible thing. But I think we have to make sure it's for purpose, and that's what it is. That the intent first off was that there would be a shared path and not a road. So we moved along. We started at quite different ends, and we've moved a lot closer where we sit now. Probably liking to the last the next one is condition 85. Because it's the matter that the council doesn't support, and I think Ms. Ryman's given her views on that, and she discussed it earlier on, and that is that she doesn't think, or the council is not very good. So this is the condition that's put up. Perhaps if I just allude on that, we have had discussions of that. While we had our and I think the position we have is that it's been offered up by the applicant because that's what was offered to that party. Looking at the condition and accepting what Ms. Ryan is saying is probably the preference for the applicant is that it's be removed. On the basis that the effects aren't, it's not addressing an effect, it's actually addressing almost a landowner relationship. The potential variation might be to only apply it to the boundary of lot 19, should that the trees be affected by the earthquakes. So to make it quite narrow through the process that we need to do, you might consider that. So maybe that it could be worded to be very narrow, just with 19 and if it's because from that perspective, again, we understand, I think Mr. Taylor's expressed a view that if the council's going to get the access way invested, it's not going to want invested in it or dedicated. It's not going to want trees that potentially fall down onto the road.
Yeah.
Safety issues. So,
just as a comment, floating an idea, would it work if you did away with the first sentence and have a bit of word tweaking just to basically keep the second sentence?
sure, any replacement of the legs and treatment, just that part.
Yeah.
I guess there was questions, and Ms. Black was not a part of it, but she said she certainly asked the question, what does replacement mean? So we tried to provide it here an explanation of what the replacement means. So it's a bit fell over through wind if it was because of health had to be taken down, or if it was because of the road. I guess we'll try.
I think you need to add during the construction process.
Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So if we were to narrow it down, then it's the sort of thing we think we could potentially use. I would say construction, lot 19 associated with dog leg, and that, yeah, keep with that. The rest of it is one, we agree with Ms. Wright that it's not addressing an effect, or in fact it's significant, it needs to have mitigation, but secondly, it's not a condition that's well written. Accept that.
And it also doesn't appear to be accepted by the party that we were trying to appease, which, you know, makes you wonder why you're making the offer. So
And at the end of the day, those trees, as you say, are on Mansell.
as well as, yeah, sorry, well, some of them are on the longer boundary, they're on both sides.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
where again, my stack, my position here is, well, it's actually something that should be with them. As by themselves outside of the creek, really. So therefore, it's a reason. So I know it's an interesting one. We've had discussion on it. So I think our preference is that to remove it, if you accept council's position or Lauren's position, which it doesn't address the effect, and it's not a good argument to take it out, then we wouldn't have a problem with that argument. If you felt it was necessary to have something in there specifically for the dog leg and to construction, then that's one way to make it. The last part on here in D on page 5 goes through the conditions that have been put through by Ms. Blackwell. So I'll probably can't speak to those who say it's obviously written down there. So it gives her position on it, and then Ms. Wright provides hers, and I'll provide mine. In my evidence, I reflect what my evidence reflects what's in here, and that the intention of trying to limit the number of dwellings, the distances, boundaries of those matters, and the height. That's what we said. And as you know, providing you that record, everything else has been turned up. So you feel it's
I finished this one.
I was looking forward to a word by word, run through the conditions.
you got a question?
Sorry, can I just jump in, Neil and Mr. Schroeder's just pointed out to me that where we've got conditions 69 and 70, this condition, when, all the track changes that have gone on, condition 70 should actually be that last sentence where it says about the signage and the road safety orders. It's just like a note under the bullet points. So I've got an updated version. There's no dispute about the wording of any of that stuff, and it doesn't change any of the other numbering when I do it properly. But
That's right.
I don't think it does anything to the JWS actually. So it should.
My table of record that I provided.
But
Okay.
So, yeah, so any tweaking, obviously, we'd be very happy to see.
And just to clarify that, I think you'll find that when I talk about where you'll find the road safety audits part, I've put 69 and 7. I say that record that I provided. Change those. That is the one that said that requires suitably.
So it comes to me today. Obviously, to say this is in response to minute 2 and 3. It did encompass some things that I would normally provide in a reply, but I felt that it was because just asked for it, so we needed to do that. There may be, so there may be some matters that maybe get a smaller, more reply that refers back when I do that too. So, now you've had a chance to read it. Did you want me to go through and highlight, or do you have some questions, or how would you like to?
I did read it, but I don't. Specific questions, I found it very helpful, just with the context of everything else that's been provided with respect to hierarchy plan documents. Etc. me, it's really just a bit dodgy to me.
It certainly turns things on your head, as to how you would normally think about it, and you wouldn't normally be considering a district plan where your guiding star was directly the MPS. So I think it's an unusual situation, but it's not going to be an uncommon one in the environment that we're facing at the moment. So I think that the key things for me really were that despite that it doesn't, having done the analysis and having looked at it, in one way makes the project more appropriate rather than less. If there were any concerns there. Did you have any specific questions?
Look, I mean, I think I'm very much the same position as Commissioner Hendrick. In paragraph 55, at the top of page 17, and we say, your last sentence, you say, consent authority can place some limited weight on rezoning as a possible outcome of the proposed PC2. I mean, I suppose equally, there's the possibility of no rezoning occurring. It could go either way.
Absolutely. I don't see any change to, and maybe it wasn't entirely clear. It's a possibility. It's a process that could be relevant. It may not be relevant if the council hearing receives submissions or hear that. They may decide that they've got that right. So the submitter applicant is in that process as a submitter that relief. I wouldn't hang my hat on it. I think it's useful to understand the context, but I think because Clean Change 2 doesn't specifically affect the site at present, I would say it's another relevant factor for you to consider rather than change that directly.
Oh, yes, no, I would completely agree.
So weight may be, a little bit or none at all. I think probably the high point of what you should take from Clean Change 2 is that it's an entirely separate process. Entirely separate process. There's a consent before you know which you are required to decide based on the framework that you have.
Yeah, and I think you've spelled that out in paragraph 59. So.
Yeah, and whatever we might ride off into the sunset on Clean Change 2 and we might not. And given the realities of the planning environment, I don't think it's a situation where the commissioners could confidently reach a decision that, considering the reasons, consent wasn't appropriate because Plan Change 2 was a submission that was very close to being considered. So we're not.
So, in your opinion, we need to reach a decision on the facts before us.
Yes. That's one of them. The other probably key point is that because the district plan provisions are almost prehistoric and don't take into account MPS special water, don't take into account any of the urban development pieces, and we're on to the third version. I think you're in a difficult situation because you do need to apply the plan within the district plan because that's what controls the application of consent. But also I think that is of
there's a big
trend
there.
in terms of weight.
Yeah. Which is quite surprising for a relatively new plan.
Well, yes, although it did start back in 2012, which we need to keep reminding ourselves because obviously it only became
2009.
2009.
It was notified to 12, wasn't it?
So there was a very long and full history
Legislation.
of the district plan. But by the time it did get to the decisions in 2019, the NPS UDC had come into effect, but was still at that regional, remember how they had to do the regional growth planning with the Greater Wellington Regional Council first. So there wasn't really anything to implement at the district plan stage at that point. So those provisions, I think you're going to really need to look at weight. I think when you're guided by using the NPS as your guiding star that you need to give effect to, and the the quite significant changes that it has made. Going back to a first principles basis, you really need to look very closely at what the NPS is doing, look at what it's saying, and I think I've made the point in here that it's not saying you can leave this to the policy team to resolve in a way, resolve claims in a way. It's saying the wording of the NPS is very, probably unfortunately for you, it's very directive that it's all decision makers, including resource consents from the get-go, need to think about how they do these things. The other, I guess one of the other key things that the NPS raises is the urgency. So it needs to apply now. We've seen it through some of the time of the directions and the enabling justification for members to the RMA, but also it takes effect from there's urgency throughout the NPS directives, and I've set out some quite beautiful, I thought was quite useful case studies. It's not on obviously the NPS UD update in May, but it does look at the themes in quite a useful way and provide some guidance about that point that commissioners need to, it's everyone's responsibility.
Could you make a note to send us copies of those?
I can send you that case. That case, the Somerset case, it's actually on the NPS UD, so it's the earlier version. But if you compare the wording, and I did this because I needed to understand the relevance, if you compare the wording of the NPS UD, the UDC, and the NPS UD, and then the subsequent version, a lot of those directive languages remained quite consistent in what it tells decision makers to do. What has changed is the application of some of the definitions, and also whether you're looking at the growth plan and framework policies, or whether you're planning for growth or whether you're enabling growth across those documents. So in my submission, that post was still quite relevant. I've taken you through 104, and obviously you'll be well familiar with that. That there were some amendments as a result of the 2021 updates and the density provisions, so sort of separate provisions out there that apply to you to this decision. I've also identified the relevant documents to have consideration under section 104. These are around non-compliant activities and some guidance there, and just another relevant case on section 104 in terms of this have regard to test. And that test becomes very important when you're looking at obviously section 104, but it's also reflected in the RPS policy 55, which Mr. Hansen says is very important in providing a fair change 1 policy 55. It's very important in providing an interim framework, but it's also very important when you look at that's the phrase used when you look to the language of the NPS and how what those directions in the NPS and telling decision is to do. So it has application across all of those key documents. I've sort of provided you with a little bit of a rundown as to what the NPS does. And just made the points about it, that the need to seize the day and it is now, rather than later. Right, this is probably where we get to next, and that may be something that I think when you sit down and start to write your decision, I think weight becomes really, really important, and is probably the only way to navigate
well, apart from the first principles of the planning hierarchy, the way that you're weighting those things in relation to each other becomes very important. So I've provided you with some snippets at 30, paragraph 30, about how the courts, how the courts have said that we do this. So obviously the NPS UD, May 2022, sits at the very top of that, subject only to part 2. The operative plan is very old. The correct approach is that where there's an old plan, you need to give greater weight. That hasn't implemented those things, you need to give greater weight to those high level documents in the normal case. And so where the district plan, and in this case, the district plan we know doesn't have effect to those things. There's not an inquiry about whether it doesn't, simply the timings they didn't exist. Which means you have to go, I guess, on the hunt further up the food chain for the answers. Set out the policies that I think are really important in terms of being directive. They differ slightly from Ms. Reid and Mr. Hanson, and I've covered it a slightly different way, but I've looked at it in terms of the directions and what the NPS is telling you to do and what we could infer in terms of your considerations, where I think the inquiry that was Ryden and Mr. Hanson were asked to do was to consider the policies in relation to and apply them in relation to the proposal. So it's a purposeful double up because of the fact that I've looked at I've come at it from that angle in terms of weight and direction to decision makers. The treatment of, so I think a key thing in the NPS is also policy 6A, and it's at paragraph 34. And this, I guess, mirrors one of the things that the NPS are going to integrate. You've got the NPS putting weight only on the planning documents that are IPIs. So where those documents have given effect to the NPS in policy 6A, decision makers are required to have particular regard to those. It's totally silent about any other document. And I think the NPS UD, one of the reasons that it does that is because if you look back to section 77, if you're doing the NDRS, implementing the NDRS standards of the Act, it actually directs that the planning or decision makers ignore inconsistent or contrary district plan provisions as an effort to push through the NDRS provisions. So I think it's a relevant observation, and I'm not saying that that's the case here. We're not looking at NDRS provisions, but I think that the NPS is making a point that around a very strong point actually around weight and the ability that recognition that there are going to be district plan provisions that are inconsistent, that's the old way of doing things, and looking at the new way is to set those concerns aside, reset, and think about how we're implementing it with, I guess it's a new mindset. I would put in the NPS. So it's quite a fundamental change in that respect. Again, we've also, another fundamental change is the treatment of amenity effects under the NPS UD, which you'll probably be well aware of, really turns the other name on its head. Policy 6 is there, recognises that there's going to be significant change to the area, and recognises that enabling growth may detract from the values, and basically says that in themselves that's not the effect. So I think, again, looking at first principles and what we derive from that, we start to look at the community effects, particularly with that question of density. There's something in the MPS there that's saying, well, we are shifting. Some of these effects might not be as important as what they used to be. Other values and other, I guess, providing housing for people is also important. So I've said that's quite a significant departure, which I think is quite important to your decision. I particularly stuff that I've given you some reasons why, looking at the Commission's concern about the southern area density, whether framing that we're looking to fix in a way that with the lens of the MPS, whether density, amenity effects arising from increased density, whether that's something, how you weigh those effects, reaching a decision. I've set out, and I guess just to close off on that point, the applicants, well, the commissioners have asked that question around the effects and things. Obviously, it's the applicant and the council's view that those effects have been adequately mitigated. So, and it is a good candidate for consent, even under the existing operative plan framework. So when you start to look at the other future or the other planning layers that have come into the top during that time, it just makes it more appropriate. So how seriously we treat those effects.
Would you, on that particular comment, make your earlier comments about the fact that it's not a plan and the latest provisions, sort of add more weight to them. Would you say that also being consistent with operative plan provisions is kind of like an extra tick?
Yes.
In that regard.
Yeah, I mean, we say it was a tick already, but if there was any question in my mind that it wasn't, or in your mind, sorry, that it wasn't, then yes, that's an extra tick. If you were on the fence about density, I'd say looking to what's come and it's available now in terms of the planning framework that you have to look at. That may be what would tip one camp or the other. It makes it more. I think it makes the density question less serious and also shows how important that achieving density is from a policy perspective in terms of providing more homes. And we see in the MPS that decision makers are charged with considering any addition to development capacity. So it's not just the significant, it's looking at these small contributions as well. I've set out how you should structure your decision, which obviously you'll be well aware of. In terms of the different sections of the different parts of the site, I think Chris made the comment earlier. The same planning framework, same consent, same activity status applies. The real question, the difference is the level or degree of non-compliance with the density standards for the rural zone. I did look to see whether there was a tricky argument around hybrid, splitting activity statuses from one to the other, or something like that that would change the framework that the commissioners were considering. It doesn't make a difference. So nothing to do with the density or the different parts of the site would change the rules of the activity status that would apply. And also, neither Ms. Ryden nor Mr. Hanson would found it necessary to separate those out in their assessments, which I think is quite telling. I've set out, and I did wonder whether I should do this or not based on our discussion, but I have set out, if you were looking at, if the commissioners were particularly concerned about the density, what questions you should be looking at to help frame the consideration. I think when you look at Site 46, I've asked what are the effects associated with the greater density, and And it's been the applicant's case, and I think also the council's experts as well, have all said that the density effects are no more than minor or can be mitigated to that, and that the density is appropriate and the effects are acceptable. So I think that answers the first question. Is there can you confirm the line effect from a density perspective that is still concerned? I think it's the applicant's case we've demonstrated that there isn't one. The commissioners will reach their own view on that. And then the next question I've asked is the density of the southern area at odds with the plan and the future planning direction? And again, it's the applicant's view that under the operative plan, it's consistent with, and it's not at odds with the plan. And that's also been this Roden's view as well. When you look at the additional planning instruments that have become operative or proposed over that time, I think the question is looking at that overall direction that the planning framework's going, that it isn't at odds with that either. If anything, it's more consistent with. So again, I think it's submitted that the answer to that question's also got to be no. If you look at those two questions, you do start to pretty quickly form a view as to, well, what's our decision here, and it might give the commissioners a level of comfort that the consideration is appropriate for both areas. Wait to place on plan change 2, we've discussed and I've set that out there. 48. It's at an early stage. Submitters, there may be a response to submitters, there may not be. I think it's a relevant matter because it's not positive. It's only interesting. I think more interestingly for you is your query for minute 3 about the proposed RPS. Because obviously that sits between the MPS and the district plan provisions. MPS district plan provisions and then the RPS sits above anything that the district council is going to do. And so I think there's, I agree with Mr. Hanson, that there's a very strong case to say that here you look to the MPS and then you look at the RPS, and we're very lucky in this case that the RPS policy 55, proposed plan change 1, actually provides for the interim period. So what should decision makers do when they're faced in this dynamic environment where there's no FDSs in place or things are coming and they're tasked with granting resources. And so in terms of the weight, obviously the RPS in the case law says that the RPS should be given more weight to really a point because it's directly implementing the MPS directives. And as a result of it doing that, if you look at the RPS policies, and they are very close to the wording of the MPS, so I think we have more confidence that those RPS directives are, not going to change as much throughout the process as because they're not facing such a difficult exercise as the district councils who are trying to take the national directive down to the and applying it at a district level where you actually come face to face with these land use difficulties and how that applies to their districts. So cases suggest proposed RPS have greater weight than the proposed district provisions. I'm not sure whether, and I think it was a really useful exercise that I did to add clarity to this consideration, but if you go to Mr. Hanson's appendices, can you look at page 1? It's out policy 45. And I think that's being able to put a lot of weight on the district plan provisions and trying to write a decision or reach a decision that responds to all the dynamic policy changes that can change one really provides quite a lot of guidance as to how to do that. So policy 55, when considering an application for resource consent, particular regard should be given to, and so particular regard being made as to genuine consideration, thought, etc. The urban development contributes to establishing and maintaining the qualities of a well-functioning urban environment. And Mr. Hanson started that assessment. And then if you go through the criteria here, the urban development is well connected to the existing urban area, particularly if it's located along existing or planned transport corridors. And in my submission there, we've got a tick if we're looking at this application. The location, design, and layout of the proposed development should apply specific management or protection values or resources identified by the RPS and sets those out. We know it's not at risk from natural hazards. We obtain those consents. So you go through that exercise, it stacks up pretty quickly that that is a transitional framework that enables the commissioners to look at the decision without having that district take guidance. I mean, I could go through and do the whole thing, but you probably get the idea. I guess the other point with this policy is you've got to be instantly get to Tupu Park, and I'd said that was another relevant matter. I think that this really, the policy actually reinforces that we can have some reliance on it, regardless of how distant the training is. It's, I guess, allowing you to grasp at straws to figure out what the direction is for the district when the district isn't quite figured it out itself. So, and then I guess I get to the conclusion that if you look at all that in the round, nothing in that framework or in the NPS or the RPS or anything indicates that the two areas of the site should be considered separately. And there's nothing that is looming in the planning framework that has turned up in the interim since we started this process that the commission should be allowed to about in terms of whether it's too soon or whether it's inappropriate or anything like that. The policies the documents are very clear in that it is appropriate to make a decision on this now, but also to look at the direction that it's going and apply that. So that's where I got to, and it was very interesting jumping through all of those documents. So hopefully it's helpful.
I've actually got a question for Mr. Hanson. Because I just want to get really clear in my mind the relevance or difference between these two RPS policies. So policy 55 is about, it says providing group urban expansion. That says considering the urban development beyond the region's urban areas, whereas 56 talked about managing development in rural areas. Under the national planning standards, this land is zoned as a rural zone. So is policy 6 the more appropriate one to look at compared to policy 5?
55.
But 55? What was it?
So it's 5 and 6.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at it in terms of, first question I had is whether the planning standards need to be relooked at.
Oh, let's not get rid of it.
Yeah, I know. And so I came back to the well-functioning urban environment question we had in a minute, and the question of what is a tier 1, which includes all of
Yes.
and also including rural areas in that as well. And so I read 55 in the context of the well-functioning urban environment. Now, 56, I'm so taking that out, I'm assuming that the regional council has determined that there are other rural areas that are outside the tier 1 area that they may have to consider some of these things as well. Now that's how I've sort of looked at it. So they've got themselves covered as it were.
I think doesn't Wellington Regional Council of Jurisdiction over the wire.
Oh, it does, yeah. It's got, yeah, that's right. That's my point. That the question is where you're applying the policies as much as what your definitions are.
So would you say that even though this presents in some ways as rural land and is subject to a rural zoning as defined by the national planning standards, it's actually policy 55 is the more relevant because it's within that tier 1 urban area.
Yeah. And so my problem is that district plan, when you then look at the definition that's in the national planning standards, identifies that as a rural zone, but the district plan itself, as we said, was way back there. And so how much weight we put on that compared back to 2012 versus where we are now. And so I saw the two policy 55, 56 as being covering the whole region. From that perspective, and that 55 is the relevant one in terms of the tier 1 where it sits.
I think the tier 1 actually also excludes, so it's Wellington Regional, Wellington City, Poirua City, Hutt City, Up Hutt City, Kapiti, so it includes all of South Wairaka, Masterton, etc. And the MPS has clearly decided to implement and provide for a definition of the document. So it's good.
Yeah.
We have to take that guidance, I think, until I did try to see if there was on case law, but
But I mean, my first point was a bit of a difficult one, but I think it's still valid that national planning standards are quite nice and tight and everyone wanted them. But have we now got a changing environment that, in terms of planning to that needs to go back and relook at it, and perhaps it does as well, but that's something we can't deal with. So I like you started off the first starting point was national planning standards identifies that zone.
Therefore 56, but
yes,
but not necessarily.
Correct.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I understand your point about the tier 1 status applying to all of the Kapiti Coast District, regardless of whether it visually looks like rural or is zoned.
And that goes back to the definition as well, which talks about.
I just think we might have asked the question. Sorry, Mr. Henry. Here you go. If you look at policy 56, you've got the definition of urban areas.
56.
Page 3. The region is. The region's areas include residential, commercial, mixed zone, industrial zones. Wellington City, Poirua, Hutt City, Hutt City, Kapiti Coast.
Okay. And amendments to the definition of rural areas right down the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I should. I was
Yeah,
thought that would be helpful, and you would find it at some point. So it was probably worth pointing out.
Yeah. I mean, we may well end up at the same place, but it's kind of like I just want to get some agreement about what it is we need to be applying.
Yes, perhaps that's something just because they've only just seen the definitions there.
You might want to address
we
the
might
right
want to
reply.
address the reply.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one does deal with urban expansion, which by
Which on the face of it, this is.
isn't necessarily would be into your rural zone because you're extending your urban areas, so I'll have a look at that.
I mean, I just like to be on the same page with some of these things at least.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Andrew, anything additional from you?
I don't think so, sorry. Nice. Yeah. You're okay. We will resume it. I hope no other things come out in the interim.
Shoot. Is right.
Being recorded. Constructive decision in that way, so,
Yeah,
This is the last decision.
is right. Anything from you? All right. In that case, we will adjourn. Time frame for your right of reply?
I said by the 20th of September. Maybe sooner. I hadn't anticipated the extent to which this ended up possibly being that.
I'm sure that's fine for both of us, isn't it? Really? So, yeah.
Trigger the need for your decision. So
Is it done?
if
Yeah.
there was, I could work around.
No, I mean, I'm okay after that. The only commitment I have is to the RM1.
That's finally happening.
Well, I think on behalf of that. The diligence of which they've got about navigating this quite difficult simplification. Again, it's been a relatively long process.
Yeah, and look, I think on our part as well, you know, on the face of it, it should be quite a simple thing, but really the speed and complexity of the way things have moved over the past few years, so just throwing so many fish hooks in there, it doesn't necessarily make it very easy for us.
We look forward to reading your decision.
Thank
See
you.
how you manage to navigate it.
Yeah, I think we look forward to that too.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Yeah, very informative and helpful.
Right. Okay.